The Fed says the U.S. economy is leveling out, and in Europe, a big surprise today. Germany and France posting unexpected growth in the second quarter. Dartmouth professor David Blanchflower is not quite so sanguine. And before you dismiss him as a cynic, let's review his resume. Until May, Danny, as he's known, was a member of the UK's Monetary Policy Committee, effectively their version of our Federal Open Market Committee, where he helped craft Britain's stimulus package. He's also a research associate with the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is the group that dates U.S. economic cycles. He's with us from Dartmouth in Hanover, New Hampshire this morning. Danny, thank you very much for joining us. Let's start with this. France and Germany posting growth, the Eurozone economy holding fairly steady in the second quarter. What did these data tell you?
Well, first, there's some small short-term signs of improvement. But I should say to people, these are actually flash estimates, and I was actually looking at the numbers this morning. They actually exclude quite a number of the European countries, particularly the ones who have had pretty bad negative growth for the few quarters. So Denmark, Ireland, Luxembourg, and a number of the East European countries aren't in there. So I would suspect when the actual number comes out, you'll see a bigger number than minus 0.1. And actually for the European area as a whole, it's actually minus 0.3. So I think these are short-term positive signs, but the French and the Germans have thrown a lot at it. I mean, they've got the Cash for Clunkers program, the big subsidies in the labour market. So my view is early days, one quarter doesn't make a trend.
Danny, are we growing a little too overconfident about the prospects for the developed world right now? In the United States, as you know, we hear people talking about a big bounce back, a V-shaped recovery.
I think that's probably a rather bold. Essentially the drop we saw was a really dramatic one. We may well start to see some improvement, but it's going to be a slow improvement. And if you look as a labour economist, as I do, at the labour market, to say that last month was a good positive sign, we only lost 250,000 jobs, is rather strange. So I think the problem for people sitting in the US is sometimes I think they aren't aware that these problems apply all around the world. So in the UK, we've had exactly the same kinds of stories. A few months ago, everybody said, oh, great bounce back, green shoots. And then suddenly the markets are surprised when the Bank of England says, well, actually, folks, it's not that great, and we're going to have to do another £50 billion of quantitative easing. So it's early days. We may see some returns to growth, but we have a long way to go. And the worry is you could have a W. You could have a bounce back and then another follow down. So Fed and Bank of England and the ECB have to be cautious and look and wait.
Danny, you just mentioned jobs, and I'm just curious, what do you think is the biggest headwind to the U.S. economy right now? I mean, is it jobs? Is it banks' failure to lend? What's the number one problem, the number one risk to give us that W formation?
I think it's for the US, and I think the story is the same for the UK. It's the fact that the banks aren't lending again, and they aren't lending enough. So what we had in a way was over-exuberance in lending, and then the problem is you have under-exuberance now. So I think the biggest worry now around the world is to actually get banks lending again, and if you like, jump-start the economy. So what you've seen are governments have been jump-starting things, putting stimulus money in and so on. But the problem is to get the banking system back to normality, and that's, I think, the biggest headwind.
Danny, you were recognized in Britain for anticipating the scale of the recession, and you were among those who campaigned to head it off with lower interest rates. You talk about the need for bank lending. Is that the only thing that we need to see for the economy to get rolling again? What else would you put in that recipe?
Well, it's certainly not the only thing. I think that I would say that the central banks have got to keep the stimulus going. I mean, yes, to say we're going to slow it down. Yes, we're going to think of it having the end in sight. But think of a green shoot. Green shoot comes in the spring. It's very tender, and a strong frost can kill it off. So I think it's keep the stimulus going and be careful and watch. The last thing you want to do is to kill off any recovery. And it's going to take a long time. If we think about recovery is going to come, yes, and output will start to grow. The question is, when does the level of output return that we saw at the start of the recession? That's the question. It's going to be some time yet. So,
okay, we've got about a minute left. I have to jump in with this last question. If the stimulus is kept in place, many economists say we're just going to end up in a hyperinflationary environment. If that's do you agree? And if that's the case, is it necessarily a bad thing?
Well, I don't agree with that. In some sense, when you are faced with the severe possibility of deflation, what you're trying to do, if you like, is to generate some inflation into the economy. So the first thing is the biggest worry central banks around the world have is severe deflation. And I say to people when you say, well, the worry is inflation, well, first let's get some and we'll deal with it. But the other thing is that central banks have got the tools to deal with inflation. It's very easy to work it out. What are the tools? The tools are, well, you raise interest rates and you reverse quantitative easing. So I think the banks are aware what to do. At the moment, the worry is to get into a depression, have severe deflation. Central banks know what to do when there's inflation.
Danny, thank you so very much. That is Professor David Blanchflower, known as Danny, joining us from Dartmouth College this morning.